How widespread is Sharia, the Islamic threat here in America? We're going to be talking about it today on Faith and Freedom. I'm Matt Staver, founder and chairman of Liberty Counsel. Our special guest is Erick Stakelbeck, who is a correspondent for CBN and also a correspondent for GBTV, Glenn Beck's television program. And his specialty is terrorism. His book is The Terrorist Next Door. And that title itself, Erick, makes me think that it's not just a terrorist over in the Middle East, but obviously it's a terrorist here and terrorist networking that's taking place right here in America.
Yeah, Matt. I mean, over the past 3 years, since 2008, 2009, we've seen dozens and dozens of terrorism arrests on American soil. Now, you don't hear a lot about them in the mainstream media in many cases. Of course, everyone knows about Fort Hood. Everyone knows about the underwear bomber, the Times Square bomber. We had someone arrested in New York just 2 weeks ago plotting to blow up U.S. military targets. These are American citizens. In the book, The Terrorist Next Door, I talk about how this is not only widespread in large gateway cities like New York, Chicago, L.A., which have large immigrant populations where you expect large Muslim populations. I think people will be shocked to know that we're seeing this also in the Bible Belt, in the American Heartland. In my investigations, I'm taken to some of the most unlikely places. Red House, Virginia, just a few miles from where we're sitting here. Willow Spring, North Carolina, in the rolling countryside outside of Raleigh. My investigations increasingly have taken me to some unlikely places. Nashville, Tennessee. So the tentacles of radical Islam are spreading from coast to coast. And here's a number for you, Matt, that I think is going to shock a lot of people. In the year 2001, there were 1,200 mosques in America. Now in 2011, just a decade later, there are over 2,000 mosques. So in the decade since 9/11, they have doubled. That is astounding, and that is not a coincidence.
Later, perhaps in the program or in the week, we'll want to talk about the controversy over the New York Mosque and why that's more than just a building, what that really means within the Islamic movement.
It's a victory arch.
But let's look at Red House, which is, 45 minutes from Lynchburg, Virginia or so. And for those that are not familiar with the geography of Virginia, Red House is right next to Red Hill, which is Patrick Henry's home at the time that he died. So Patrick Henry lived in that area. Right there in Red House is a place called Muslims of America, I believe is what the name of it is. And it is a compound of trailers, but this is where the Islamics live. And there is a street there named after the individual who was suspected, or at least the individual that Daniel Pearl wanted to interview, thinking that he might have been involved in the shoe bomber. And on the way to interview him, he was captured and killed and beheaded. There is a street named after that sheik right there in Red House. You visited this, and it's actually in your book, The Terrorist Next Door. What did you find?
In the book, Matt, I call it Southern Inhospitality. Sheikh Mubarak Jilani. He's a radical Pakistani cleric. He lives in Lahore, Pakistan. He is the spiritual godfather of this group, Muslims of America. Now, they are an offshoot of a group in Pakistan called Jamaat al-Fuqra. I think that's an Irish name. I'm not sure. But they're an offshoot of Jamaat al-Fuqra, and they have compounds throughout the rural United States. Now, Red House is a small rural town, a one traffic signal town. They have a large, sprawling compound in this tiny town, just 45 minutes from Lynchburg, where they're doing weapons training. Many of these guys are converts. They're ex-cons. They converted to Islam in prison. It's a heavily African-American group.
So when you're saying they're doing weapons training, give me more specifics about that. What are they actually doing?
Well, look, I talked to neighbors who live around that compound, Matt, who said every night we're hearing weapons being fired. We're hearing gunfire. There's targets, target practice. There's been videos captured from various Muslims of America compounds showing them doing military training. They have these compounds. According to the Department of Justice, I cite this statistic in my book, they have at least 30 of these compounds sprinkled throughout the rural U.S., and it's amazing, the street sign, as you said, in Red House, Sheikh Jilani Lane. The street sign is actually named after this radical Pakistani imam, a guy who's been linked to al-Qaeda, to the Taliban, and as you said, Matt, the Daniel Pearl killing.
And Daniel Pearl was going to interview him. to interview him to see if there was a relationship between him and the shoe bomber.
That's right. Richard Reed, the shoe bomber.
Richard Reed, the shoe bomber.
Now, Jelani denies all involvement, says he had nothing to do with Pearl's killing. And Muslims of America, they will tell you we're a peaceful group. But I spoke to an ex-member who went rogue, Matt, and he said, look, they raise all of their money through illegal activities here in the U.S., bootlegging, CDs, DVDs, petty crime to raise money, and a tenth of all of their money, each member, is sent back to Pakistan to Sheikh Jelani to fund and support who knows what. So that's their version of tithing.
Now, this is not the only one. You said that there's 29 or so others besides this one in Red House, Virginia.
There's a big one called Islamberg in New York up around the Catskill Mountains. That's their main hub. Islamberg and here in Red House are their two largest hubs.
I was reading the book called Sharia, Threat to America, and it's written by a number of different people that are experts in Islamic threats. One of the things that it did for me is it opened up my eyes to a point that I had never seen this before, and that is the widespread nature of Islam and the radical Islam that you're talking about here. We talk about Al-Qaeda, but that's just one of many. And oftentimes we equate the radical Islam, the terrorism, with Al-Qaeda, but that's just one of many. There's many. There's, for example, one of the things it talked about was Sharia financing. And AIG is the biggest company in the United States, which we bailed out, that promotes Sharia financing. What is the concept of Sharia within Islam, and how widespread is it? Because we think of Sharia and Islam as the bombs and the people strapping bombs on their back and blowing themselves up. That's one aspect of an overarching goal. There's other things before you get to that. Talk about that.
I'm going to talk about Sharia, but I have to hit on the point you made at the top of your question. You made a great point. This is not when the Obama administration talks about the quote-unquote war on terror. And by the way, terrorism is only a tactic. We're not fighting terrorism. We're fighting an ideology. But they talk about the war on terror as if Al-Qaeda. If we defeat Al-Qaeda, we can pack up our bags and go home. This baby's over. They don't talk about Iran, Hezbollah, the Muslim Brotherhood, which I would argue are much greater long-term threats, and in Iran's case, short-term threats than Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is just one cog. It's a multifaceted enemy. The Obama administration deliberately misleads the American people to elude otherwise, to make people think we're only fighting Al-Qaeda.
And hasn't the Obama administration even abandoned the war on terror?
They don't use that term.
They don't use that term. They've tried to excise that from their vocabulary.
Violent extremism. Janet Napolitano, the Department of Homeland Security chief, has called Islamic terrorism man-made disasters.
Yeah, and they're also careful about not even using the word Islam.
Never. I've seen Department of Homeland Security documents, Matt, where they're talking about violent extremism, lone wolves. But Islam, Muslim are never mentioned in official Department of Homeland Security documents. This is the atmosphere we're in now under the Obama administration. And frankly, it began in the second term of President Bush, I have to say. He went from talking about Islamofascism, rightly, to talking about violent extremism. Now,
I think a point you made is very important, and that is sometimes we use the term war on terror, and that's a tactic. But what you're talking about here is an ideology. Now, if that is the focus, that becomes a whole different issue. And that really opens up the can of worms. But it gets down to the very heart of what we're talking about.
Yeah, and Sharia, which you mentioned, is a vital part of that ideology. I would argue it is the driving force in that ideology. Islamic Sharia law, to sum it up, is an all-encompassing ideological system which dominates every aspect of a Muslim's life, to the way they wear their pants, to what they eat, to how they treat their wives. Under Islamic Sharia law, there is no freedom of speech. There is no freedom of religion. There are no women's rights. Christians and Jews are second-class citizens. This is enshrined in the Quran. Christians and Jews live as second-class citizens in a Sharia society. They are called dhimmis. That's what they're called in a Sharia-run society. It's a bleak, as you can see, Iran, the Taliban, Sudan, these are Sharia states. It's pretty bleak.
One thing I found interesting in the book, Sharia, Threat to America, is that murder is not a crime against the state. It's a crime against the individual under Sharia.
That's right.
So, for example, if a father were to murder his daughter, the only way that that prosecution could go on is if the wife, who has an interest, would want to prosecute. But if the wife did not, then the state can't step in and prosecute. So you get away literally with murder under Sharia.
You make a great point, because I think what you're alluding to are honor killings,
Correct.
which are on the rise here in the West, where, long story short, a Muslim male can kill his daughter, kill his wife, kill a female family member if they bring dishonor on the family. It's a common practice in the Middle East. It's coming here in the West as the Muslim population increases.
Well, tomorrow I want to talk with Erick Stakelbeck, our special guest, about how widespread it is. We talked about this manifestation of these 30 camps, but it's more than just these 30 camps. It is pretty widespread. His book is The Terrorist Next Door. Erick Stakelbeck, correspondent for CBN and also for GBTV. We're going to be having him as our guest tomorrow, and I think it'll be a little bit surprising to most of you about how widespread Sharia is actually here in America. Go to Liberty Counsel's website, lc.org, and order the book, The Terrorist Next Door. That's lc.org.